Welcome to this Introduction to Mudbox tutorial. In this tutorial we'll be covering most of the sculpting tools, properties, sculpt layers and paint layers, and looking over some of the actual import and export features and the subdivisional level. Okay, so this is the basic introduction. We will be doing further tutorials which will actually cover more advanced methods of sculpting and digital painting for game creation. So to start off with, we're just going to have a general look over the interface. If you're already familiar with using Maya, you'll actually find the interface and the navigation quite easy to follow. So to start off with, we have our main viewport. Now if we press spacebar, unlike in Maya, we don't actually flick to different views. We stay in the same view. We'll cover the actual changing viewport a little bit later on. Next thing we want to look at is at the moment we're in our 3D view. We can go to UV view, we can go to image browser, and we can go to Mudbox community. Now the Mudbox community connects online and will connect to different aspects of the actual Mudbox community, including kind of home, which will give you information, gallery, which will give you some gallery features of people who actually created elements and assets in Mudbox already. Profiles should connect to different users of Mudbox. Library will connect to library assets that you can download, whether they be sort of textures and different types of actual assets, weapons, things that you can just download and practice with. And tutorial, which will feature different tutorials for creating assets and sort of creating different elements within Mudbox. Okay, so generally you'll be in the 3D view. So the 3D view does have some contextual menus built into it. So if we right click, we'll see we can turn off the grid, we can turn on flat lighting, display curves, include lighting, wireframe, show both sides, and then we have our switch views, which we can switch camera view from perspective, top view, side view, front view, or we can go back, show both sides of the model, and turn off gradient background. That contextual menu will change if we have a piece of geometry in here, which I'll show you once we import some new geometry. So just like Maya, we hold down our Alt, use our left mouse key to orbit around. We can use our right mouse key to zoom in, dolly, and zoom in and out. We can also use our middle mouse key if we hold that down to sort of pan around, and also the scroll wheel, which when you don't hold down the Alt key will zoom in and out as well. You can frame all, which should give you a kind of view of the whole area, which is just by pressing A, and then if you're hovering over an actual piece of geometry, you can press A or F and it will actually zoom in on that geometry as well. We have our view queue, which we can go to home. We can actually change our views just the same as we could do in Maya by rotating around. And in here we also have, related to our viewport, under the lower tabs we have a thing called camera bookmarks, which we can actually add camera bookmarks in place, which again I'll go through in a little bit. Okay, so first of all we're going to actually create some geometry in here. So I'm just going to create something basic. So we go to our create menu, go to mesh, and all we're just going to do is create a cube. So you'll see it brings a cube in, and we can orbit around that cube. So this is just actually a full 3D environment, unlike ZBrush, which you may be used to using if you've used any sort of sculpting program. ZBrush is kind of 2.5D, which means it redraws the image when you rotate and then reflattens the image. This is actually a full 3D environment, which means there's certain performance limitations. When you start getting up to the millions and millions of polygons, you may find it lags depending on what system you're using, but that will again be for high resolution sculpts. Okay, we can turn our wireframe on by either right clicking and going to wireframe, and that turns our wireframe on our geometry, and we can turn that off, or we can press W on the keyboard. We'll show the wireframe. Okay, so just jumping over to the right hand side, you can see we're in the layers tab at the moment, and so when we brought the cube in, it brings up this cube selection here. Now this is the current active geometry. The cube, if we have many different pieces of geometry, we'll have to go down to the object list and actually change to which is the active geometry. You can see in our object list we have our cameras listed, our light, our material, and actually our object. Okay, viewport filters, we generally don't use many of these, but we do have some sort of display filters. So there's tone mapping, depth of field, cavity and ambient occlusion, general ambient occlusion, screen distance, normal map, and non-photorealistic. Each of these also will have properties. So if we click on one of these, you'll see some properties appear below. This is our general properties panel for everything, and we can move this up and down to give it more space in the properties, or more space in the top tabs. Okay, we'll just turn that off. Okay, so we generally won't be using the viewport filters for this series of tutorials, so we're mainly in the object list and the layers list and the object list. So just going back to the layers list, we're currently in sculpt. Now what we can do is we have our option box here, so we can create groups. These are some new features in the 2015. Obviously through the tutorial with the cone we're currently running in 2016, but again I'll go through some of those important options with the Mayor LT opposed to the standard Mayor and how that works within Mudbox. Okay, so what we can do for this is we can create a new layer within the sculpt section. So we can go to new layer here, or we can click on new layer here. This will create a sculpt layer. So if I start sculpting this geometry, and again we'll go through the sculpting tools in a bit, so I can sculpt a shape onto this geometry, and that's part of this sculpt layer now. And if I turn that off, you can see actually that layer vanishes, or I can change the opacity on that layer and actually just reduce the amount it's sculpted. Okay, if I subdivide this geometry by going to our mesh and add new subdivision level, you can see this layer becomes locked because it's locked to that specific subdivision that we were set at before. So if we wanted to sculpt further, we'd have to create a new layer at this subdivision. Now if I go back down the subdivision layers, so if I use my page up and page down, or I can go down to mesh and go down to step down, you can see this layer becomes active. Okay, we can flatten this layer so it no longer exists but the geometry is still sculpted, or we can just delete it and get rid of the sculpt if we don't like it. In the paint layer you can see we have essentially the same options. We can create a new layer, so let's go to our paint options. We can create a new paint layer. Now it will also give me the options in here of naming that paint layer, the resolution of that paint layer, the type of format we want to save that as, and the channel. So we have choices of diffuse, specular, gloss, incandescence, opacity, vector displacement, bump, normal, and reflection mask. Okay, so if we're just going to create a diffuse, which is just going to be our colour pass, click OK, we can now start painting on here. Turn the strength up. Get rid of the stamp as well. So we're painting on this layer. Let's just turn my mesh off. And you can see we're just painting based on the camera. So I'll just fill that one side in. And again, as this is part of this layer, I can either turn that off, or I can kind of fade between either it not being there or being full opacity. And again I can delete that, I can flatten that, and I also have some other options as well which we'll cover in a later section. Okay, so just moving down onto this bottom section where you've seen me use the sculpt tools and the paint tools. So under the sculpt tools we have a full range of sculpting brushes. Now we'll be covering later on what each one of these does, and there's also a crib sheet handout that actually lists what each of these brushes do. We can also add tabs to this, and we can also create new brushes. as well. In paint tools we also have a full range of painting tools that do again different options, which again we will cover in a later tutorial, and there's also the crib sheet. We have curve tools, which you can actually draw curves on geometry, and that will stick to the geometry. Just undo that. Actually redraw that back in again. We have grab to curve, which we can actually alter the curve that we just created. We can have smooth curve, which will smooth out that curve. And we have erase curve, which will erase parts of the curve or all of the curve. We can create a curve loop, and we can create border curves as well. Pose tools are for generally when you've got actually characters in here, and you can actually create joints and pose them, paint weights, and move different pivot points. Again, we won't be covering this in the basic. This is going to be more for the advanced section. Select to move, where we can actually select faces, and we can also move the object or rotate the object, scale the object, and we also have calipers as well, where we can use those for kind of measuring distances as well. Okay, so that covers those tabs. In this right hand section we have different stamping options, and these are used with the different types of brushes, whether those are sculpting brushes or paint brushes, and we can add a stencil to our brush. So if I'm sculpting, let's just so under the sculpting tool we're going to just go up the division, and I'm going to click on the sculpting brush, and you can see once we open a sculpting brush we open our properties for that sculpting brush. Again, we're going to cover some of these a bit later on, but I've added this stamp, and now when I draw paint on with the brush, you can see it changes the actual from being smooth when it's unstamped to having this kind of rough texture. Okay, so we can undo that. So with the brush on, we can change certain things like stamping distance. So we can have quite a wide stamping distance, and that will give us different textural effects using the brush. And again, we've got quite a few different types of stamps that will have a different effect as we paint. What I would recommend doing is actually experimenting with these different brushes and the stamps and how they kind of work with each other. We can do those. The next one is stencils. Now these are slightly different. These actually appear in our viewport, and when we move around they just stay where they are. We can move them, we can scale them using the S key, and right at the moment using the right mouse button. I can move them around using the middle mouse button, and I can rotate them using the left mouse button. We also have some properties for each of these stencils, just like we kind of what we do in the stamps as well, but they're basically built into the brush rather than having their own separate properties. So we can invert the values, hide when sculpting, so when we actually paint through these we hide. Let's just go back to our brush a second, turn our stamp off, go back to our stencil, and you can see that actually we're painting through this stencil. If we try a different stencil, you can see we're actually painting that pattern onto the surface of the geometry. Now it's low resolution at the moment, but that is because our cube that we're working with is low resolution. If you up the resolution of the cube, you'll up the resolution of how the stencil works. So you can see that that one actually hides when we're sculpting. You can flip the vertical, flip horizontal, use tiles, and then turn off the tiles. We have multipliers and visibility, so if we go to multiplier, lower the multiplier, it takes a lot longer to paint on the stencil. Okay, so again, what I would recommend doing is experiment with some of these. You can also manually transform some of these assets as well. Well, you can, when you're tiling, you can scale them out, and you can make your own tiles and stamps and stencils and bring them in. So you can add your own stencil from outside and kind of bring it in to the program. Okay, we have specific stencils as well here, like human ear and scales. So if I go to the human ear, I can see there's lots and lots of human ears at the moment. So I might want to turn off tiles for that and zoom in a little bit. But this is a very sort of detailed vector displacement stamp. Put the multiplier onto 10. You can see as we bring this out, effectively this should sculpt an ear into our geometry. Just taking a bit of going through. That's actually, I need to go back to my sculpt brush. Currently I'm using the my mouse to do this, but I would normally only use a graphics tablet for using Mudbox with. You can see that it is actually sculpting an ear and it's actually erasing from there. And again, we have the same with the scales. You can see we can bring these scales in. I think the scales are tileable as well. Okay, so I can experiment with these stamps. We have some of these ones here which are coloured, like this brickwork is actually coloured. So if we're in the paint layer, we add a new paint layer, and we just create a coloured paint layer. Go to our paint tools and actually use our projection. We can paint this texture straight onto our geometry. So that's kind of photographic reference there being painted straight onto the geometry, which is really useful when you're creating game assets, as you might often use or have some reference, photographic reference that you've either created a tileable texture from, which you can then import into Mudbox and actually use it straight onto geometry. So again, really useful, and what I recommend is experimenting with that. When you are in the stencil, you have to turn the stencil off, and again you can see that texture is on there. Now what you want to be careful is as well as this kind of stretching, so be careful when you're painting. Okay, fall off. Moving on, let's just create a new piece of geometry. Just going to create a new scene. And you can see our fall off here. This is our brush nib. So we have our brush. Now when you're in one of the sculpting tools, you can see the properties. We have our strength and our size, and we have a few other options here which we will go through soon, but the main ones at the moment are strength and brush size. Now if we change our brush size, you can see it'll get smaller. The strength, you won't see much difference until you start actually trying to sculpt onto the geometry. Let's just divide this, so mesh, add new subdivision level. So you can see, let's just turn down the stamp spacing. Again, we get a much smoother effect there, but you can see the fall off kind of the strength of the brush as well. So we get like a peak in the middle and it drops off and kind of plateaus into our geometry. So again, you don't see any sort of reference when you're actually sculpting to the strengthening, because I'm doing it with a mouse. You can see it's just clicking straight on. So the higher the strength, the further it will build the sculpt layers out. We have a shortcut for the strength, which is M, and you can see a little like line up here at the top of your brush. and when you press M, and as you left click and drag left or right, the actual strength will go up and down. So you can see that's the lowest strength, and then go the highest strength, and again you can see this updating in the side here. Okay, so that's a shortcut for controlling the strength. And brush size, you hold down B and you can just left click and right, move left and right, and you change the size of the brush. Okay, so back down to this fall off. So this is our current brush pattern. So this is the center of the brush, and this is the edge of the brush, and center and edge. And we can see two different brush profiles here. Let's just change our strength so it's not quite as strong. Brush size slightly larger. I'll just do a stroke down the center, and then I'll go to this profile and I'll do a stroke down to the center, and you can see straight away there's two very, very different types of profiles there. Yeah. So if I do this one here and then move to the next one, it's a very similar profile but slightly wider drop off. Again, this one's now starting to look more like this one. In fact, that was our original one there. So a much larger bump at the top there. Again, just going through all the profiles to look at the different profiles. So this is going to be the largest bump at the top. Quite a fat stroke. And that shows you this is looking down through them. They're all quite raised apart from this one here. And that one's half the size of these. And then we have our square, which is just very much a block pattern there. If we change our stamp spacing, you can see it just draws little blocks in the geometry. Not very good for when you're working at a low resolution. Turn our stamp spacing on, we'll get a much smoother but much jaggeder edge on the side. So that's the fall off. Material preset. Now this is the material that's currently on your geometry. Now you generally shouldn't need to use any of these presets because you should be using all your own, but you can click on these and it will actually go through different types of materials, which can be really useful again for game textures if you know kind of what material you're looking for. Again, what I would recommend, this is our default. Just go through different ones. Graphic shader. It's more like your Lambert that you would normally get in Maya. More like a Fong there. Soft grey. Some very sort of similar skin looking textures as well. Silicon those ones. Silicon dark. Reflective white. And you can see we actually have proper reflection in here of kind of like a material that's already pre-built into Mudbox. Reflective red. That one's classed as reflective light. We have our chrome. Reflective bright. So again, just what you want to do is experiment with some of these. Now you can click on material. If you right click on the object, you can go to edit material. So now you can actually start going in and changing some of these attributes within the material. Okay, so we can change our diffuse color. Green. We can change the specular. Now again, just like any normal texturing, and you've hopefully gone through all the information crib sheets about texturing and how texture maps work, but we can change this specular and actually have a higher specular count on this one. This one currently in very little specularity. That's the most specularity. Click done. We can change the gloss level. Again, very little gloss on it at the moment, but we can actually highlight that gloss. Incandescence, and that's kind of the glow. of an object, we can change that. And if you're in a package where you can export the material into as FBX and bring it into Maya, then you can bring these material presets with you. We've got bump map, normal map, reflection, mask, which currently we're on the highest reflection, but we can start bringing this reflectivity level down. And again, we're changing the whole look of the material. Again, we can change opacity, currently full opacity, sorry, full, and then we're actually making the actual object more opaque. Again, this will kind of bring everything through for you. Again, there's some more options as well down below: bump filter width, reflection mask. If you've got a specific reflection texture you want to use, you can use that yourself. Reflection strength, Fresnel, bump index, which we're not changing at the moment, Fresnel refractivity as well. You can have receive shadows, blur edges, shadow colours. So it's got quite a different range to edit some of the materials. Should go back to our default. Oops, and we probably want to reset, do a preset on all the edit materials. I've just changed all the default material, so what I'll do is I'll just open a new scene again. We won't say that because we don't want to change our default material, but we can bring in new materials ourselves as well. Lighting presets. This is where we can actually set up different lighting, which is really good when you start adding normal maps and bump maps and starting to get into the higher resolution of sculpting. Rather than using this very simple flat light, you're better using a different kind of lighting system. So this is kind of like more of a 3-point light there with colours. And again, we can come and edit these lighting presets as well if we want to. And again, there's different types of presets for lighting. Again, I don't know which one default is. Okay, so we can actually add a lighting preset, create a name for it, and then edit that lighting preset. Camera bookmarks, like I said, we can actually add a camera bookmark. So if you've got a specific position you want to look at your model from, you can come in here and add a camera bookmark. Title it position 1, and then if I move anywhere else around here, I can just click on that and it will automatically snap back to my original position. Okay, so we've kind of covered most of these areas down here. Let's just look through our kind of options at the top here. So we have our standard file, new scene, open scene, incremental saves, export screen to Photoshop document, re-import from Photoshop, import UVs, export selection, export all paint layers, open recent files. One of the most important ones in here is send to Maya. Now this doesn't work in Maya, well, this version I have at the moment doesn't work in Maya LT. If you have the full suite, Maya suite, Mudbox suite as well installed, it may work. I need to test that myself, and I'll sort of give an update on one of the blogs about that. But we can send this scene to Maya, and the current version I've got installed 2015 of Maya, I can send whatever I have in this scene straight over to Maya, and it's a really sort of intuitive pipeline where we can just send it into Maya, then back from Maya, and swap it around just to kind of get the right look and feel of our sort of project. Edit, again we've got all the same ones: undo, redo, duplicate, delete selected, select all, invert face selections, deselect all, draw selection, select all borders, lock selected, invert, locked, lock all. And then we have this freeze section, which will come down to when I talk about the freeze brush. Set topology axis, validate meshes, freeze transformations, edit stencil. Okay, then we have this create, where we've just seen where I can bring preset objects, create different types of curves, create new cameras, create new lights, create new materials. Selection sets, again we shouldn't really need to be going into different sets in this because it's to do with the UVs. That's more for an advanced section. stencils, and tiling plane. So the selection here where it's the stencils is for creating a new stencil, and the tiling the plane is for actually any sort of paint or sculpting you do in one plane will automatically be duplicated into different texture planes. Again, not something we have to worry about just for now. It's in more of an advanced section. Okay, mesh, add new subdivisional level. You can see there Shift D is our shortcut for that. Add new subdivisional level options, Control Shift D. If you look at the actual menu, it gives you certain options like smooth position, subdivide UVs. Again, more advanced stuff that we don't need to worry about for this particular project. Step up and step down, that's just going up and down your divisions of your mesh. Rebuild subdivisional levels and delete highest. Again, not something we could be getting into these tutorials really. Maybe more, we might use some of these when we start looking at doing the rock face. Reduce mesh, retopologize, create mesh from curves, duplicate selected faces, flip mesh, make symmetrical, patch, tighten selection, fair selection. These are all some of these are new things, again more to do with the advanced. Display, so this is actually how we view our viewport stuff really, sort of frame selection, hide selection, unhide selection, hide all curves, isolate, so we can just isolate a single piece of geometry, and again really useful as well as using the option, the object level, where we can sort of turn meshes on and off. Once we get into really high resolution sculpts, really useful just to keep the workflow going really well. Turn off grid, mesh errors, these again all really sort of just general viewport display options. Expert mode will actually turn pretty much everything off apart from your main viewer, and then you can actually use the shortcut keys to kind of operate Mudbox. Again, really useful, time saving if you're not using multiple monitors and you want to kind of see your sculpts at full resolution. UV maps, we're not really going to get into these just yet until we actually start doing our textures, but these are all to do with creating UVs, PTEX setup, which we won't really be using for games, as these can be edited in Photoshop. Extracting texture maps, sculpt using maps, which again we may use for the rock face. Rendering is actually just all about actually rendering what we have in our viewport, where we can save screenshots, record movies, and create turntables. So if you're doing like a high resolution sculpt of a character, you can actually record that whole movie, and every time you're not sculpting, it won't record anything. So it's kind of like almost like a little time-lapse version. Windows, just essentially bring up different options from our sort of viewport. You can actually see our hotkeys and change our hotkeys. Image browser, layers, so we can actually rip out things if we're using multiple monitors there. Okay, so that's kind of a little overview of kind of everything there. Let's just have a look at some of the brush options. Okay, I'm going to create a new scene. So we've gone back to default on everything now. So just going through some of these brushes now. We have the sculpt brush, which is your basic sculpting brush. Really just does it just is a standard sculpting brush, but you can change quite a few of the options. Just go back to our default of everything there. You can change quite a few of the options in here to get a nice varied look, and it's a really useful brush, and you'll find yourself using it quite a lot more often than anything. Okay, so going from the top, we've already covered the size and strength. Mirror. If we turn this on, we can actually add a line down. Let's just move our viewport slightly over. So we've got mirror in the X. So now every time I draw on one side, it'll draw on the other, and it's just mirroring in the X direction there. Mirror in the Y. And mirror in the Z. Essentially just mirrors everything you're doing. Makes life a little easier. Okay, let's just get rid of those. mirror locally in X, locally in Y, and again these are different types depending on where we have our local X, Y and Z, and we can also do it based on tangent mirroring as well. Okay, let's just go to X, invert function. So instead of sculpting out, it will sculpt in, and the other option for that when we don't have it selected is to hold down Control, and that will invert the brush as well. So without the control, with the control. Stamp is essentially about turning on these stamps here, depending which ones we have selected. We can, like I said, turn these on. We can randomize the stamp as well, and we can also tweak sort of how random it is in different things. We can flip horizontal, so that will be kind of how random it is in the rotation, how random it is sort of in direction, so it kind of won't follow a path. Same of that for kind of the Y, the scale, random scale, and random strength. So these are all kind of really useful things to use as well. Like I said, stamp spacing. If we have stamp spacing at 0, we get a nice straight line. As soon as we start opening stamp spacing, we're kind of drawing dots now. Again, something to consider and kind of really useful. Snap to curve. If we have any kind of curves in our scene attached to our geometry, because we can draw. Let's just turn the mirroring off. Go back to our curve. Let's create a curve. Go to sculpt. You can see it will snap at a certain distance to the curve. If we can increase that, it will snap closer, and if we decrease that, it won't snap to the curve at all. So that one you've got to be quite close, and it'll jump off the line. So if you want to kind of really stick to your line, you need to make sure that that's selected quite high. Like I said, when you contextual menu wise, once we've got a curve on, we actually get and right click on the curve, we get different options. Delete curve. Like I said, if you do this outside, you'll get one menu, and then you'll click in here, and you usually get another menu. For some reason we're not. Oh yes, we are. Yeah, sorry, I just can't see it. So you can see we're getting this menu in here. If we hold down, once we've actually got some geometry in, if we hold down the spacebar now, you can see we actually get different options in here. So we get different brushes, paint brushes, pose tools, materials, translate, brush strength and brush size, lighting, which is general sort of lighting information, and we get some other kind of options here as well. Okay, that are actually part of our properties. So these are all in our kind of properties of our brushes. Okay, so that's kind of quite useful, and again, that you'll get wherever you are on the scene. Again, right click and left click will give you options to those, give you these sort of menus to those. Okay, so going back to sculpt. So that's the snap to curve. Let's just turn that off for now. Build up. So at the moment, that's kind of the amount of material I'm putting on with a standard stroke with the mouse. If I increase the build up to 100, we're getting a lot more material build up. So essentially that's kind of your build up. By default it's usually set to 50. Okay, so steady stroke. Click on steady stroke, and when I click left and I drag down, you can see we dragged this little green arrow out with a dot on the end. Now I can move that around anywhere and my brush isn't moving. It won't start moving until I get to the end of that green, and it'll actually allow me to create much steadier motion. That's currently with steady stroke set to 4. If I try and draw that shape again, kind of with steady stroke off, it's not too bad, but that is a much kind of more flowing path path. And again, I've had plenty more practice, so when you start getting used to this, it might be nice to put steady stroke on. I can change the distance to anything up to 100. You can see I get a very large sort of green line out there. Usually anywhere from sort of 2, 4 to 6 is good. So that's 4. 2 will give you a lot shorter one, but again still allow you to get some pretty tight motions in there. 8. The larger the bar, usually the steadier the stroke will be. Okay, so flood. Now flood, if I click on flood now, it will flood that whole shape with my kind of brush, so it just actually fill everything out. Now if I do that onto a layer, so if I create a layer first and then flood, I can actually then change the opacity and kind of go down back to either original or just slightly out. That is really a really useful tool, and something I can highly recommend using at times. You can reset all of your properties. Then we have fall off, where we can actually create our own brush fall off here. So I could create something like that and then store to fall off, and then we get that fall off saved there. Whether that's a useful fall off, but you can also make this larger and sort of start making your own kind of custom fall off brushes if you like. Okay, you can also do fall off based on a glancing angle from the camera, which is also can be really useful as well. Again, a bit more advanced than what we'll be doing at this stage. Remember size, that will remember the size that you have that brush set at. If not, whenever you change brushes, it'll automatically default to whatever size you had it set for the previous brush. So again, something to consider, certainly for things like your smooth brush. Okay, orient to surface. So that orients to surface, rather than painting based on the camera, it's actually painting based on the orientation of the brush. So if I turn that off, you can see go above the top, and it just kind of still stays flat. But if I go to orient to surface, it actually will orient to all of the contours. You can see actually even going over these bumps now that we've created. Okay, and then we have pen pressure, and again I'm not currently using a pen pressure, but you can set your maximum, your minimum, and you can change the actual direction based on centered normal, average normal, vertex normal. Again, if you've gone through the crib sheet on normals, then you should understand kind of how that works. Okay, so smooth. So create a shape, click on the smooth brush, and that one will just smooth that stroke out. Essentially, that's kind of how the smooth brush works. Now we can be in any other brush and use our shift key, and shift will automatically default to the smooth brush no matter what brush you're in. So again, that's a really important thing to consider. Pretty much the same settings that we had in the other, so again, make sure your settings are correct for how you're going to use it. Grab brush. Grab brush will actually grab the geometry and pull the geometry around. So based on the brush size and the brush strength, we'll grab it around. Again, very similar, missing quite a few of the options there, but this really important ones are grab silhouette, which means it grabs right through the geometry. So if I click on, kind of go to my side view, click on here, move back, you can see it's just grabbed that corner. Click on grab silhouette, move down here and grab that. You can see it's grabbed right through the geometry. Follow path. Sorry about that, I just had a bit of a crash there. Just going to go back to grab. We have again fall loss for these. Advance, again the same, remember size, orient to surface. Okay, moving on, pinch. So the pinch brush will, if we sculpt something out here, and go into our pinch brush, and just kind of pulls the geometry together and kind of will pinch that geometry closer together. Again, depending on what the strength is, let's increase the strength there. You can see it's kind of pinching it into a thin line there. Again, that has pretty much the same options as some of the other brushes. So a lot of these do flatten. So flatten will, like it says, flatten the surfaces. So just flattening those edges off. Again, uses the same some of the same options. We've actually got some new ones like whole stroke. Pretty just gives you actually a lot tighter flattened edges there than the standard without whole stroke on. And update plane, which again I'm not really massively sure what update plane does. Oh, okay. So okay, update plane then. Looks like it actually will pick so without update plane on. Okay, so it's working on anything that's got kind of brush strokes already on it, and it's actually bringing the mesh up to that. No, maybe not. Yeah, this one looks like with update plane on it, kind of it's flattening the geometry to that top of that plane. So it's actually kind of filling, almost kind of filling in the gaps there. Again, so really useful. Okay, foamy. Essentially, kind of, it's got a slightly different way it builds up the brush. A lot of these you can actually hover over and it'll tell you some details. So the foamy tool is intended for initial shape forming rather than for creating fine detail. So again, using it like you would use a normal sculpt brush, but this one just builds up slightly different and a bit of a softer edge to it. So spray. So a spray should be used with a stamp. Let's just have a look and see if the stamp's already on. Yep, spray is currently on, and it kind of will spray almost like a spray paint effect on that stamp. Essentially, again, if you're ever unsure what something does, just hover over the spray. Sprays the stamp randomly along your stroke. Essentially, repeat. Again, that's the same one where you use it with the stamp, where we can. Not really doing it there. Again, depends which stamp you're using, but so like rivets on the wing of a plane, things like that you actually want to repeat areas. Imprint's another one that you should use with the stamp, and what it does is actually draws out that stamp. You can rotate round, scale it using just the drawing out, and when you let go it will actually add that stamp on. Again, if we kind of subdivide this cube quite a bit, we'll actually get a better feel. You can see actually what it's done to that. Add that kind of rocky surface onto the top of there, and we can kind of smooth it back a bit, probably a bit too much. And you can draw on smaller areas. Again, options that we have for here in advanced, remember size, orient to surface, and just fall off. So not really many options, but you can see the fall off, actually how the fall off's working with this particular brush. Oh yeah, we can also click on draw from center, and it won't draw from the center, it will draw from another angle. Again, we can alter the strength of the brush to kind of get different effects for the actual stamp. Okay, wax. I actually tend to like wax for kind of building up in the same way because it feels more natural, like real sculpting, and actually how it kind of builds up layers. It feels quite natural in a lot of ways. Not great for too much fine detail, but kind of really good for kind of building up initial shape, and it doesn't ever tend to go kind of out of control and too high up. It is kind of just like adding thin layers of clay to an object. Again, we've got similar sort of options in here. I don't think there's anything massively new. Again, you can use hole strokes, which is kind of really good for kind of blocking out and kind of getting rid of uniformity on edges. And we've got that update plane as well, which is kind of will bring out, will kind of fill in areas to the top level of that plane. You can see there we've actually kind of flattened all of that stamp work out there. Scrape, again, similar to kind of the wax tool, good for kind of roughing off areas and getting rid of sharp edges, and really good for kind of working. Once we go into the rock face, this would be really good for the rock face. It really comes into its own there. Again, you can use hole strokes on this as well and get some nice kind of sharp edges. Using this with it in conjunction with a stamp is usually really good as well. You get some really nice effects. Okay, let's create a new scene. We're on the scrape tool. Okay, fill is just like it says. If I create 2 lines here, go to fill, it generally will fill in any kind of rough, fills in any gaps and things like that, and doesn't generally go above what is the classed as the highest point of geometry. Knife tool, and it cuts. The knife tool works much better once we're at higher resolutions, and works with the stamp spacing, but it's essentially for cutting kind of quite harsh gaps into things. It has a pre-built stamp for the knife tool, so you can turn it off, and you can see it just essentially becomes a sculpt tool. And with that specific one's turned off, again, I don't think there's anything massively different to that one. It's got pretty much the same settings. Smear will kind of smear the mesh, won't lift it up, but it'll smear it around. Bulge, and kind of inflates areas. Again, I don't think there's anything really different about bulge. Nope. Amplify will kind of extenuate any sort of, add extra detail to any way we've actually already got something, kind of like because we've got like a knife cut in here, it's kind of adding to that. Yeah, again, we'll do the same. It'll amplifies the effect. Freeze is an interesting one. Let's go back to our preset if we can. We've got enough. Nope. So instead of doing that, I'm going to just actually delete this and create new ones. Cube. So freeze. Now I'm going to subdivide this so you get better results. We can draw on, and it essentially draws on this kind of blue paint. Now obviously at the moment our strength is at 100%, our size is at 18, but we also have other options where we can lasso. That will fill in an area in blue there, and again, depending on what your fall off is, you'll get a different effect. Sharper edges depending on what fall off you're using, and you can also use marquee. Okay, so when it's blue, Oh, and the other thing as well, like I said, the strength, if you go down, you'll get slightly less effect. So 100% effect or variations of that. You can see we've got the fall off there, build up, orange surface, smooth values, smooth and paint values. These are kind of new options in here. It's because we're not paint. It's because we're not actually in paint mode. So depending on kind of what it's set to. Don't really know what that's doing, but if I use that in conjunction with something like the sculpt tool now, and just like before when we created a sculpt layer and we go to our thing and we flood this, you can see it's flooded it everywhere bar where our kind of freeze was selected. We can come in and smooth these edges. And I think even more importantly, wherever it is, this one here, this is frozen, but it was half sort of opacity, so it's actually adds some effect but not as much. Again, what we can do with this sculpt layer now then is we can kind of bring this down, smooth our edges out, and we also have some other options here. We can right click and we can go to wherever it's gone. Nope, it's not in that one. So in one of the options, we should have an option which should be, just like this up here, is invert freeze. So we can actually freeze this area now, and we could actually do another flood if we wanted to, and actually change different options. Then we can also deselect as well. There is an unfreeze somewhere. I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere. And there's also the isolate. Oh well. So go down to edit, and then we've got shift and U as well to sort of unfreeze, and we can unfreeze that, and then continue to sculpt and mess with our model. Mask. Okay, so the mask, what the mask does is essentially, we've got a sculpt layer here, we can actually delete parts of that sculpt layer using the mask. Now, we've got the same sort of options for the mask that we had before as for the other one, and if I hold down Control, it will bring them back. So Shift to delete, sorry, just standard to delete. And then if we just actually hold down just with it on standard, we just actually kind of delete some of that masking area off. So that will work on each sculpt layer. Okay, what we can also do is we can change the magnitude as far as I'm aware of this, and we can actually delete it slower, so it takes longer to kind of go through and delete. And erase, again, does pretty much a similar option. If we hover over here, we can see the sculpt, it erases the sculpting in the current sculpt layer. The mask lets you mask off areas of the object where the sculpting in the current sculpt layer should not be applied. It hides rather than deletes the sculpting. You can erase the parts of the mask to restore the sculpting. So hold down Control key as you stroke. To show or hide the mask, as a red brown tint, turn on the masking, show and hide masking layers UI. So we're in the layers. Oh, I don't know if I've actually done anything. that's it. There you can actually see where the mask is in red, essentially in the user control. Okay, so that covers all the sculpting tools. Now just quickly to go through the painting tools. What we're going to do is we're going to click on our paintbrush. We don't have a sculpt layer at the moment, so if we click on a paintbrush and click anywhere on our object or in this viewport, or essentially I think just in the viewport, it'll actually ask us to create a layer, or we can just do this in here. Okay, so we just created a diffuse layer. Again, the options are, we now have a colour option, so I can paint in any colour we want. We have this colour wheel, which we can view spectrum, image, so I drop in an image in here to actually select a colour from. Yes, we have numerical input values with RGB or hue, saturation and value, and we have colour palettes as well, so we can actually have a specific colour palette where we can save our colour palettes that we're using. And again, all you do for this is let's just go to strength at maximum. That will paint on. We've currently got a stamp on, so again they work with stamps as well, and we can just paint on that colour. Okay, if we choose a different colour, that essentially will paint over the top of that colour, and the opacity takes them away. If we create a new sculpt layer, paint over the top of there, we can turn this one down, and it'll actually kind of show through the other paint layers as well. Like I say, you can use this with masks that can be randomized. You have stamp spacing, snap to curve. You get similar sort of similar kind of controls, but we can disable pure color filters as well. So it says no translucent at the edges of a stroke. Okay, projection, which we've kind of already seen, where we use it with our stencils, where we can actually paint through using a stencil on a particular colour. And again, we can create as many different layers as we want for that, and again we've got all the options. Eyedropper will actually select a colour. Now obviously if I've kind of painted a colour on here, or I've got kind of like a blend of colours, I can use the eyedropper to actually kind of select that colour. Airbrush, again, it's kind of like the painting but will behave more like an airbrush, a lot softer. Pencil, again it's like drawing on a pencil, which can be really useful for sort of mapping out specific areas. Erase, we'll erase whatever we've got there. Clone stamp, let's just go back to our paintbrush, or in fact let's actually go back to projection, and let's just project this on here, just onto this side. Let's turn that off and go to clone stamp. So we've got some options for clone stamp here. So to use the clone stamp, you must first control click the point where you want to clone from. So control click there, and then when we paint up here, it will paint whatever it sees here. So if you use clone stamp in Photoshop, it works in exactly the same way. Just be careful how you use it, that's all. Dry brush. So the dry brush will kind of only paint on areas that are either higher. So if I try and paint in here, it won't paint the lowest areas. You may, if you've ever done any model painting, you may have used the dry brush technique. Yeah, if I undo that, if I hold down control, it will only paint in the lower areas. Very useful painting technique for sort of when you're adding dirt to areas and sort of age to areas. Blur does exactly what it says, it blurs the paint depending on kind of how strong the brush is. Dodge lightens areas of colour, and again with a lot of these you actually get the option to flood, generally flood from camera. and I don't think we've got any more options really for those. Burn darkens areas of paint. Contrast will actually change the contrast. So increases contrast or decreases contrast if you hold down Control. Sponge reduces it intensifies the colour, sort of desaturates the colour essentially, or if you hold down Control, saturates the colour. Hue is actually changes the hue of the colour, so we can actually paint over a different hue. So go to green over the top of this red, we'll paint and that as a green. Yeah. Hue shift will actually shift the colour to its opposite on its colour wheel. So if you look at kind of a colour wheel chart, let's just go back up to colour wheel. But essentially we'll let's just see what it says there. So 180 degree shift. Yeah, so we've got the colour wheel here. It will automatically shift to 180 degrees across, depending on whatever colour you've got selected. And finally we're going to look at how to use masks within the paint layers. So we're just going to create a new paint layer, and we're going to create a diffuse, and we're just going to go to our paintbrush and fill it full of a red colour. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to add one of these masks to our diffuse. So it's connected to this paint layer particular, so this is the only paint layer it will work on. And what we can do with this, let's just change our brush size. Okay, we can use in the paintbrush and selecting a colour. We need to be selecting kind of something in the range of black or white. If we paint black, we actually paint back through to the either original colour, which is our original material, or we can go paint white, and that will fill that back in again. So it's like a non-destructive mask essentially. So we're keeping it there, but we can alter it as much as we like. Now we can go to like the mid grey, and we can see we're starting to paint some of it away, but not all of it away. Okay, so we can do a range of how much we paint away as well. Okay, so if we have another paint layer, let's just actually disable this mask first. Let's delete that paint layer. This is our diffuse. Let's add another paint layer over the top, and let's pick a green to fill this one with, and then we add a paint mask to our bottom, well, in fact not to our bottom one because that won't make any difference. We add a mask to this layer that we just created, and then go to the black. We can kind of paint through and see red. Okay, and then we can actually add some of that back in. Actually, let's stop painting it away. Let's go to full strength white, and let's add all of that back in, so we can start painting areas back. So it's really useful tool having those paint masks. You can create some quite good stuff, and it's really nice for kind of also blending between two paint layers. Okay, that's the end of the tutorial, so I'll see you next time.